Did God commit genocide? People making the charge that God committed genocide are typically referring to the destruction of the Canaanites. So let's look at how all this unfolded. You cannot just ignorantly read one verse in the Bible and summarily condemn God, assuming you understood what was going on without doing any study. There's actually a lot of history leading up to this event in the Bible. I'm going to show you that, in fact, no genocide was ever committed, nor was genocide even a motive, and there is not a single incident that records any children were even killed by Israel during these battles. The Canaanites, in fact, lived on and are traceable to the later ancient Greeks and Phoenicians. The primary mission was to drive them out of the region, and there was no order by God to pursue them any further. Now, we need to keep in mind that God has already condemned all of mankind to die for our sin. So the timing when God executes that judgment is always in His discretion. So the Canaanites who died in those battles didn't suffer a fate any greater than you or I are going to. It's only from an atheist point of view where this becomes hopeless, where death is hopeless. From a Christian point of view, we have hope that through God's grace, right order will be restored, including our very lives after death. Death is how we all exit this land of good and evil that Adam and Eve willingly entered. So God's decree against the Canaanites, we read in Deuteronomy chapter 12. The Lord your God will cut off before you the nations you are about to invade and dispossess. But when you have driven them out and settled in their land, and after they have been destroyed before you, be careful not to be ensnared by inquiring about their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? We will do the same. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. Deuteronomy 12, 29 through 31. So God is warning the nation of Israel. Don't fall into the same snare they did. Do not fall into their sinful ways, or you will suffer the same fate. So God's judgment against the Canaanites was righteous, and the order was to drive them out of the land. Only those who stayed behind would be given no quarter. The Canaanites were a murderous and sexually depraved people who would have carried deadly diseases like syphilis. Even their children would have had those diseases. So if the Canaanites chose to use their children as human shields, they would not be spared either. The Israelites may not adopt their children, thereby intermarrying with them and contracting any number of deadly diseases. The Canaanites were literally unclean. So God's motive here is to drive the Canaanites out of the Holy Land promised to Abraham. Only those who stay behind and fight would be destroyed. And that's actually what you see if you actually read the entire context of these events. So let me give you just a little background behind this. In Genesis 9:22, we find that Canaan is actually a person. He's the youngest son of Ham, not a nation. In that story, we read Ham, the father of Canaan, shamed Noah while he was drunk. The actual sin he committed is not really understood, and that's a whole nother topic. But generally, these people are identified as the descendants of the sinful man Ham. While we could do a long study on how these tribes originated, suffice to say, the Canaanites are actually the name of, for a blanket name for groups of people in that region who are the descendants of Ham and Canaan. So the land in question was promised to Abraham centuries earlier, as we read in Genesis chapter 15. It says, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, to your descendants I will give this land, from the Wadi in Egypt to the great river Euphrates. And then he goes on and lists a long list of tribes of people. And the Canaanites are among those tribes, but they're all the descendants of Ham and Canaan. Now, originally, Abraham had a good relationship with these people in this region, and God was not going to condemn them at that time. At this point in history, they were hospitable to strangers and not the depraved, murderous tribes they would later become. But God told Abraham in a prophecy that in the fourth generation your descendants will come back here. For the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Genesis 15:16. The Amorites were descendants of Canaan. So God is telling Abraham, I know they will become very wicked people, and I will have to render judgment upon them at that time, but they are not that now. God bore with those people for 400 years. God was not going to depose those people from the land without just cause. This order to depose them from the land and destroy those who stayed behind was not a random decision, but the result of hundreds of years of sin and depravity that had accumulated in those people. So the real takeaway message we need to learn from this entire epic journey is that sin is like a cancer. It grows in us as individuals and grows within nations as well, leading to our destruction. The depravity of the Canaanites was the result of centuries of sinfulness, resulting in maximum depravity. God is holy, and He will not bear with sinful people forever. And even the Israelites later on, having become sinful and not heeding the words of not following the ways of these people, are themselves deposed from the land. And in spite of the depravity of the Canaanites at that time, God even then graciously allowed them to flee from the land without being pursued. If they left, they would not be pursued. But those who stayed behind and fought and did not do as they were ordered were destroyed. And that was God's judgment. Like I said, God's already condemned all of us to death, and it is in His discretion when He's going to execute that judgment upon us. So in the final analysis, we see that genocide was never a motive. And in fact, genocide was never committed. And so this is a false charge against God that we are hearing here on, especially out here on the internet. The fact of the matter is the Canaanites did live on. They didn't all stay there and die, and are traceable to the ancient Greeks and Phoenicians, and no doubt every single one of us today are probably related to these people. So God was being gracious to us and allowing those people to flee as well. So I hope you enjoyed this short study and that you got something out of it, and at least that you realize that this charge of God being unjust and a genocidal monster is just false. And I would hope that you will study the Bible on your own so that you cannot be duped by people who make these charges in ignorance. So God bless you, and thank you for watching.